I do wrong, it's out of character. When you do it, it's typical. When I do wrong, it's a blip. When you do it, it's a pattern. When I mess up, there are extenuating circumstances. When you do it, there is no excuse. This kind of hypocrisy comes naturally to us, but it thrives in a religious environment. Jesus saw the hypocrisy of religious leaders all around him. In Matthew chapter 6, he saw three kinds of religious activity: giving, praying, and fasting. The hypocrites, they did give, but they couldn't give to charity without blowing a trumpet to announce it. That's Matthew 6, verses 1 to 4. And they prayed, but they couldn't pray without standing on a street corner to advertise it. That's Matthew chapter 6, verses 5 to 15. They could fast, but they couldn't fast without disfiguring their faces so that all would know their religious seriousness. That's verses 16 to 18. And so as we turn to Matthew chapter 7, we see how these self-righteous fools judge all those terrible sinners out there. We thought yesterday about Matthew 7 verses 1 to 2. Judge not lest ye be judged, because Jesus is seeing the religious hypocrites all around him. Judging, judging, judging. Jesus sees through them. And he says they are like eye doctors who are tut-tutting about the speck in their patient's eye. All the while they've got a plank of 4x2 in their own eye. In the old King James translation, it spoke of the tiny mote in our brother's eye and the giant beam in our own eye. But in modern translations, they usually render it the speck and the plank. The mote and the beam, the speck and the plank. And here it is from Matthew chapter 7, verse 3. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. It is an image both comical and painful. Can you actually imagine what Jesus is describing? Two hypocrites saying, oh, did you see that nasty, speck of sawdust in that person's eye? Did you see that? And the other person says, Bill, is that you? Is that you? It's a ridiculous image. But it also rings true. It's a lot truer than we want to admit. The other day I was driving up to a roundabout, and the car on the roundabout came off sort of the junction before I was meant to come on, and it didn't signal to let me know that it was coming off the roundabout. And if I had have known that they were about to pull out, I could have pulled out onto the roundabout about 1.5 seconds earlier. Their failure cost me my precious, precious time. But I was so busy shaking my head at this inconsiderate driver that I both entered and exited the roundabout without having signaled at all. I only noticed when I was 30 yards down the road that I hadn't put my blinkers on at any stage. Hypocrite. Seeing the speck in my fellow driver's eye, failing to notice the plank in my own. This kind of hypocrisy is very easy to fall into. What's the way out of it? Let me suggest 4 ways that we can avoid hypocrisy like this. Number 1, laugh. Not at others, laugh at yourself. This is what Jesus encourages with his humorous word picture here. He wants us to see the absurdity of our hypocrisy. He wants us to vividly picture our overinflated sense of self and then burst that bubble with a sharp dose of ridicule. When we notice our hypocrisy, we should say to ourselves, what am I like? I look like a human Dalek with a tree trunk poking out of my eye socket, murmuring about the state of someone else's eye grit. I am ridiculous. And I need to stop taking myself so seriously. That would be a great help. Firstly, laugh. Secondly, get proportion. I have the plank, you have the speck. In every relationship, that's the proportion. The problem is 99% me, 1% you. Of course, from your perspective, it's 90% you, 1% me, but I'll leave that for you to figure out. My burden is the plank. Yes, in time, Jesus wants us to sort out the plank so that we can then sort out the speck in our brother's eye. That's true. That is the end goal. But first things first, I have the plank, you have the speck. That's the sense of proportion. Thirdly, every time I feel a critical spirit rising in me, it is an opportunity not for conceit, but for contrition. When I see sin in others, my response should not be, phew, at least I'm not as bad as that guy. It should be to question, oh my goodness, how is my sin reflected in this? Perhaps I do the same thing. Perhaps I commit some equivalent sin, not the same expression, but the same motive. Maybe even the way that I'm behaving contributes to this problem. Or maybe it's my superiority complex, pure and simple, that needs to be addressed. I'm a sin. Whenever I see sin, I should think, well, what's my sin? And then fourthly and finally, look at Jesus. He is the one who came down among us. He's the only one who actually sees clearly. He's the only human being who is actually able to see the human condition for what it is: depraved, distorted, dead. He has no plank in his eye. He sees everything. And yet his response was not to fold his arms and shake his head and say, "Shame on you, shame on you." He opened his arms, he bowed his head, and he said, "Shame on me, shame on me." It's astonishing grace, isn't it? And it shatters our pride. The one who truly sees our sin in all its panoramic ugliness, he is the one who nonetheless bestows grace on us. If that is how he has treated us, how can we, hypocrites, treat anyone with less grace? This grace shatters our pride, and it lets us know, look, today I have the plank, you have the speck, but we both have Jesus, and there's enough grace in him to heal us both.